the PS4 controller, which can only mean one thing. Today's video will be a brief history of EA Sports NHL franchise, which henceforth shall be known as Chel. This topic was a suggestion from John in the comments of the FIFA video. So thank you, John. And if I thought that FIFA was hard to nail down in 30 minutes, Chel has an even longer history. So let's get started. So the game actually goes back to 1991 in a sense. We often sort of associate the first edition of the game with 1994. Whenever anniversary editions come out, it's in relation to 1994. But the game actually sort of goes back to 1991. The first installment of the game was called NHL Hockey. Though there was a license issue in Europe, so over there the game was called EA Hockey. Did I say? In North America it was NHL Hockey, in Europe it was EA Hockey, just in case I said that wrong. And it was developed, like FIFA, originally for the Sega Mega Drive or the Sega Genesis, depending on where you were in the world. Now, EA did not actually develop this game. Cat hair. Nowadays, EA develops most of their games themselves in-house, or in one of their many studios that they've sort of acquired. Especially the big money-making sports games. We'll get back to that money-making aspect when we get into the more modern editions, the more modern installments of the game. But back in the 80s and 90s, early 90s, they often published games that were developed by external studios. And this one was no different. It was developed by a studio called Park Place Productions in 1990. EA had initially contracted them to develop John Madden Football for the Genesis. And that game, John Madden, had been described as the most successful sports game of all time. So it's not too surprising that EA went back to Park Place for more games, including Muhammad Ali heavyweight boxing for the Genesis and NHL Hockey. By the way, Park Place Productions, you might not recognize the name now, but they went on to become the largest independent developer of computer games in 1993. They made 45 games for 14 different publishing companies that year. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. We'll come back to these guys because it gets a little spicy. So, in North America, EA did have the NHL license. So, all of the team names, like the proper team names and their logos, appear in this 1991 game. However, they didn't get the license for the NHLPA, the Players Association. So all of the players in the game were referred to by their numbers instead of their names. That also made the transfer easy for the European version, because remember, they didn't have the NHL license for Europe. So the teams in the European edition of the game, the teams were portrayed as international teams. There's no governing body like FIFA that holds those rights. So it was purely a cosmetic change there, because you could pretty much identify the teams one for one with their team colors. But having no names on the players made it really easy to just sort of flip a switch between NHL team and international team without having to change up the rosters. Now the game modes, obviously very basic in this game. You could play the Stanley Cup playoffs with like either a single game elimination series or a best of 7 series. That being said, the game came out to fantastic reviews. Mega, which was actually a Sega magazine, they placed the game at the number 2 spot of their top Mega Drive games of all time. So the first game is a huge success. The next game comes out in 1992. And we now consider it to be part of the franchise, the Chel series, that second edition. But it actually never had the NHL name attached to it. The game was called NHLPA Hockey 93. So, as you can probably tell, this one just went in a completely different direction, the opposite direction from its predecessor, where instead of having the NHL license, it has the Players Association license. So, all of the teams are referred to by the city only. You had, for example, I'm trying not to make a mistake and name a team that didn't exist at the time, but we can play it safe with like Montreal, Boston, Chicago, but not the actual team name. And the New York Islanders were called Long Island, so as not to confuse the two New York teams. So no NHL logos, emblems for the league or for the teams appear anywhere in this game. And we also now get 24 teams because the Lightning and the Senators joined the NHL that year. So Ottawa and Tampa Bay would have been 2 other teams that I could have named. Now, the third game comes out in 1993, 1994, 1993, yeah, for 1994. And we finally now get the proper nomenclature. So it's called NHL 94. Now, this game is developed by EA Canada. So, remember Park Place Productions? Well, one of their programmers, Jim Simmons, he actually programmed the first John Madden football game and the first NHL hockey games for the Sega Genesis. Well, he went to work for EA. EA essentially decided to contract him directly, basically cutting out the middleman, which in this case is Park Place Productions. And that was sort of the beginning of the end for Park Place, unfortunately. By the end of 1993, remember, they become the biggest independent studio. Well, by December, about a quarter of their staff left to work for Sony. And that was the last time we'll hear about Park Place in this video. Now, this game is finally licensed for both the NHL and the NHLPA. So it's the first game in the franchise that feels complete in that sense. It also includes the 2 new expansion teams. Do you remember who that would be? The Mighty Ducks of Anaheim, as they were known until 2006, and the Florida Panthers. And EA does make some major improvements for this game. A big one is the introduction of the one-timer. And this is really a milestone game for the franchise. Computer Gaming World in 1993 said that this game had a playing environment that is flush with realism, excitement, and credibility, and that players will lose themselves in the simulation and feel they're in control of a televised NHL broadcast, an experience well worth the price of admission. And that sort of narrative still holds today. IGN actually ranked the game number 47 on their top 100 games of all time. Now, this was in 2005, so obviously video games have evolved substantially since that time, since the list was written, almost 20 years ago now. And, now IGN doesn't really include sports games in their rankings. But it was revolutionary, NHL 94, and I think it deserves a place in the conversation of video game history. In fact, something that's kind of fun and interesting about this game is that Jeremy Roenick, he credits his fame to the exposure that he received in NHL 94. He was sort of one of the best players in the game, and this is a guy who played 9 NHL All-Star games, and he credits his fame to NHL 94. I think that's pretty cool. Now, those 3 games that we've talked about, they're really the building blocks for the series, right? They were the essentials. And for the next maybe 15 years, we can go through the games relatively quickly. The 5th installment, NHL 96, so we'll skip over one. 96 is noteworthy because it was the first game to feature 3D graphics. there was also an adjustable opponent AI for the first time, where you could basically play against different strengths of teams. The Spinorama made its first appearance in this game, and fighting. So the developers EA were not allowed to program in fighting in the previous versions, essentially because the NHL was trying to promote a more wholesome image of the sport. But EA was determined to add fighting. It was a selling point for the game. So the NHL eventually agreed to allow them to add fighting to the game on the condition that fights were limited to 2 fights per game. That's a fair compromise, I think. I wonder what the stat is for like the average amount of fights in an NHL game. I'll have to look that up. So again, NHL 96 was game-changing, literally, no pun intended. So it's often considered to be the best installment in the franchise. You hear that about 94, about 96, and maybe 1 or 2 more games that we'll get to. But then the franchise sort of hits a lull. And this is a criticism that you hear a lot with the modern installments of sports games. They get stale. They don't really improve on anything. In fact, a review for NHL 2000 said, in the end, NHL 2000 is more of a sidestep than it is a leap forward. And I think that's the perfect way to sort of summarize that conversation around sports games. And so, the critics, or the critiques, the reviews, the ratings, they did suffer for the stagnation, the staleness of editions of the game that followed NHL 96. Now, there are a couple of gems in the decade that followed. 04 and 07 are often considered, brought up as being fan favorites. I was reading in The Athletic recently an article about a group in Scandinavia. I want to say it was Finland, but I might be wrong there. One of those countries where they still get together once a year and have a tournament, I think on 04, but they mod it so you have current teams and current rules and all that kind of stuff. But let me focus on NHL 10 here for a moment. This was the 19th game in the series. It was released September 15th, 2009. And it just came chock full of new features. You had new board play physics where you could play the puck along the boards, sort of get pinned up, kick it, all that stuff. You had, new forechecking, action after the whistle, which could lead to penalties and fights. There was a new passing mechanic. They also included for the first time the Be a GM mode, which was huge. It's basically where you can, the title says it, you can manage a team as the general manager. So it's more of it goes deeper now. It's a deeper game than just the gameplay. You also have the team management side, which I'm explaining this for basically people who maybe don't play sports games as much, because nowadays it's considered like an essential mode in any sports game, really. So this game, NHL 10, it set them up perfectly for the next couple of years. NHL 11 and 12, they were also pretty big hits. I think that 11 was actually the game where they switched from animation-based physics, or I should say animation-based gameplay, to physics-based gameplay. So all of a sudden you get a more realistic game. But it did have its bugs in 11, so 12 came along and they improved on that. And I'll skip ahead one again, but NHL 14 was a huge game. Fans voted for the cover athlete, which happened on a few editions, to be fair. But in 14, in 2013, Marty Brodeur won. And it was the first time since NHL 97 that a goalie, was on the cover of the game, on the official cover. Now, this game, NHL 14, it overhauled 2 of its game engines. So, they actually used other sports games that were also developed at EA Canada to sort of overhaul the NHL engine. So the collision physics were now powered by the same technology as the FIFA Player Impact engine. And then for more realistic fights, they used a new Enforcer engine, and that was based on the Fight Night game series. This is also the first Chel game with a new deking system, and it was the first game where the Be a Pro game mode had some off-ice elements to it. So again, for people who might not play this game, Be a Pro, kind of like Be a GM, is where you're playing as one player and you can sort of play him throughout his career. And now you had elements of the game where you were off of the ice and you had to make decisions off the ice that would impact your player, his legacy, all of that stuff. And to be honest, I think that this is a game that is more appreciated today than it was when, by its contemporaries at the time that it came out. And unfortunately, things sort of go downhill from there. And by downhill, I don't necessarily mean that they get worse, but it just, stays the same. And by the time you hit the 20s, critics and reviewers really start to echo what people have been saying for a while about most sports games, most franchises, which is that, beyond an annual roster update, there's really nothing noteworthy about the new installments. And they're quite forgettable. And listen, my take on that, and it's not a hot take, I'm sure I'm not the first person to say this, but the developers, in this case EA, they're really just focusing on coming up with new ways to make money in online modes. And the base game really isn't worth their time as they see it anymore. The online modes are the money makers by far. I mean, everyone's gonna buy the base game anyway. But those microtransactions, baby. When IGN reviewed NHL 91, they gave the game a 6 out of 10. And they wrote, NHL 21 is at its best when I'm playing the wacky modes in World of Chel or the new HUD Rush, where I can just go end to end while trying to pull off skill moves. It's aggravating that during this whole console generation, so NHL 21 would have been the PlayStation 4, the Xbox One, I think. I'm a PlayStation girly. But they said, during this whole console generation, EA never managed to move past the legacy issues like ping-pong passing, a lack of creativity in the offensive zone, and a narrow set of player ratings that make the gameplay feel stagnant. Which I think 6 out of 10 in that respect is generous. But I guess you do still have to rate the game as a standalone and not totally take into account the previous versions. So fair enough. At the end of the day, it is a fun game, and if you don't take into account, if you pretend you're brand new to the franchise, never spent a penny on a Chel game before, 6 out of 10 seems fair enough. But and beyond just those legacy physics issues, I can't help but wonder where these game modes, like the Be a Pro or franchise mode, which is I think what the GM mode is called now, franchise, I can't help but wonder where those modes would be if they benefited from more development, more focus from the developers. Like, I'm a huge fan of Football Manager. And nowadays, I gravitate way more to that game than to a Chel or a FIFA, for example. And that's totally just me, because I'm not a HUD player. I'll dabble into World of Chel when I'm feeling brave, when I need some excitement in my life. But, if I'm going to play a management mode, I'm going to play Football Manager, and I wish that existed for hockey and for, football, other sports. But with that, I can see that I've got just a few seconds to say goodbye before the camera shuts off. So thank you very much to John for the suggestion. Thank you to you for hanging out with me for the last half hour. I'll see you in the next video. Bye.